Okay, so that is, today, we are getting into kind of the modern era. So it's kind of exciting. You're going to start seeing a lot of what you're familiar with in church is starting to come to pass in this lesson today. So, but we are going to back up the lesson. We're going to start, well, this is 1600s to 1800 or so. We're going to start to talk about the Puritans, which is, I'm calling it the English Reformation Part 2. Now, 2 weeks ago, Scott talked about the English Reformation, and he had a lot to say about this great family here. This is King Henry VIII, and he's surrounded by all of his family here. Now, this is allegorical because many of these people were not alive at the same time. Some of the people were deceased at this time.
Deceased by Henry.
If all these people gathered in the same room at the same time, probably not all of them would come out alive at the end of the day. So this is truly allegory, but it was painted to depict that the family was united, that the kingdom was strong, and all this sort of stuff. So it is allegorical. But what's interesting is we see several of our major players in one painting. You see Henry VIII seated there in the center. To his left, sitting next to, that's interesting that you can't, there we go. Over on the left, you see Philip II of Spain. Mary married Philip after she became queen, but they were, so again, she would be married to Philip in this picture because Henry VIII is already on the throne. Next to Henry VIII is Gregory, or not Gregory, Edward VI, and he is shows him kneeling as being subservient to the king. He was the next in line to the throne. Then we have Elizabeth over here to the right, and so it's interesting that in that one painting you have 4 monarchs. So yeah, now we're going to talk about, I'm starting here because we're going to talk a little about these monarchs and how they impact the Puritan movement. They all have a huge impact on that movement.
The lady in red does not look like a Puritan.
No, she is yeah.
But who is the palace guard after?
See, I actually thought that, but I read about that and it said he is actually in position like defending the family. That's what he's supposed to be portraying. He's not attacking, he's defending.
Jane Seymour, isn't Jane Seymour one of the wives?
She's one of the wives, and she's actually deceased at this,
So
but,
why is only one of the wives?
well, okay, again, it's allegorical. She's, well, that's the only wife that's displayed here. Elizabeth is a daughter, but the wife, Jane Seymour, she's the father of Edward.
She's the father.
She is the mother of Edward. So that's why she's there to show the continuity of the, the lineage. Like I say, it's all allegorical, just showing the strength of the family. But I chose this picture because it shows all of them together, and it is kind of humorous to see such a united portrait of a family that was so dysfunctional. So,
If Anne Boleyn was in it, she'd be holding her head.
oh, we'll get to that later. But we have another, okay. But little known fact, this is the Tudor. I actually grew up in a Tudor family. So I don't know if you all guys knew that. we had a Tudor. And then later my parents, they went to the Tudor family.
They really had those cars too.
What?
You really had those cars
We
too.
really did. Those really were our family cars.
Now, who put that slide in there? Was it you or was it Wendy?
I'll never say. All right. Now, there's a lot of stuff on this slide. We're going to get, there's 2 or 3 slides like this that have a lot of details. I'm not going to read everything on these slides because we don't have time to do that, but I want you to see kind of the progression and the impact of all these people. So Henry VIII up here in the top left corner, he separated from the Roman own church. But his interest in separating was not theological necessarily, except he didn't agree with the rules about divorce. That was his main beef with the church.
Well, killing
But-
your wife.
Yeah. So he was not motivated by theology necessarily. He was rather ambivalent about the theology. So he separated from the Church of Rome, but he retained a lot of the Catholic traditions and doctrine and practices and things like that. Edward actually was the first monarch that grew up Protestant, if you will. He was taught by his teachers, taught him a Protestant tradition, and so he was actually very open to Protestantism. He officially recognized Protestantism in England and encouraged church reforms, much more so than his father did. Now, another thing about Edward, though, you have to understand, is he became king when he was 9 years old and died when he was 15. So it didn't have a lot of impact there, but he was still, his contribution was that he really initiated reforms for Protestantism.
That's crazy to think about. Just 9 to 15.
I know.
Even the stuff that he
Well,
did.
with all
do
his
for that.
advisors, right? Because Bruce Scott, the one talking about all of his advisors, the guys who were very well.
Or it could have been Mary slipped something in his. Yeah. So Mary was the older daughter of Henry VIII. If you go back to the painting, you see she was the one on the left side. She was initially disqualified from being a monarch, but then she was later reinstated. She received that privilege back. But so when Edward VI passed, she became queen in 1553. Now, she was staunchly Catholic. Now, you notice in the picture, who was she married to? Philip II of Spain, which is a very Catholic-centric culture.
And was he the Holy Roman Emperor, or?
The son of-
No,
He was
that
his son.
that was his dad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So
He was
was
seven.
Mary in Spain at the time of Edward's passing, and then she came back to England, or was she in England?
I don't know where she was physically, but she was, no, actually, she wouldn't have been in Spain, because she didn't marry Philip until after she became queen. So,
Yeah.
so they were not married when she became queen.
Yeah, she became queen in 1553 and she married Philip in 1556.
Yeah.
When Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, decided he was tired of being emperor and king of Spain and and went to the monastery and lived there.
Yeah.
He'd had enough.
Wow.
I know.
So real George Washington. kind of
Yeah,
guy.
exactly.
Right. So because of her Catholic proclivities, she sought to restore the Church of England, or England back to Roman Catholicism, and she persecuted the Protestants very heavily. She became known as Bloody Mary.
Was she
Now, on the-
concerned about earning a salary?
Pardon?
Ah.
So along the bottom portion here, and I did this for you, Scott, because Scott asked me if I was going to talk about John Knox. And my first thought was, well, a little bit maybe, but really he has a significant role to play in this whole story. So I put in some information here about John Knox. He was ordained a Catholic priest in 1536. And then in 1543, he met and became associated with George Wishart. I'm not sure if that's exactly how you pronounce his name. But Wishart was a Protestant. He was a reformer, and he caused a lot of headache for the monarchy in Scotland. And he was eventually he was executed. And when he was arrested, John Knox initially said, "I will go with you," and Wishart said, "No, no, no. You stay, because we need a messenger. We need you to carry out the message." So he didn't go with them. So his life was spared. But a year later, the reformers, in response to Wishart being executed, they retaliated and they captured the castle of St. Andrews to protest his execution. A couple of years later, in 1547, John Knox joined them at the castle. So they held the castle captive for several years, and he became the chaplain in 1547. But that role was short-lived because also in 1547, the castle was recaptured with the help of Henry II. Now, in Scotland, the Queen was married to the King of France. So this is why the King of France had an interest in helping out. So he sent troops to, it wasn't like France had a big beef with Scotland, but he wanted to help his wife restore order in Scotland. So he sent troops to Scotland to help recapture the castle. John Knox then was arrested, and he was held as a galley slave, and he sailed around Western Europe on a slave ship for a few years. So I did not know that about John Knox, but he was forced to do that for several years. He later looked back and said that was one of the best times of his life. It was very defining for him. So he saw good come out of that. Well, in 1549, the ship was sailing up toward England looking for, scouting out the ships in the area. John Knox had become severely ill, so they decided they were just going to drop him off. So they dropped him off on the banks of England and had mercy on him. And later that year, he was licensed in the Church of England. Well, when Mary became queen and she started persecuting the Protestants, John Knox was among the English Protestants. He was no longer in Scotland, but he was living in England at the time. He was actually, one of the tutors or helped school Edward VI at one point. So, but anyway, he joined the Protestants during the reign of Queen Mary, fleeing to Zurich and Geneva and other places in Europe, which were more friendly to the Protestants. So there's a great exodus between 1553 and 1558 where the Protestants fled to Geneva. So in Geneva, this was a very, can't think of the word, but a fortuitous event that they went to Geneva, because who did they encounter in Geneva but John Calvin? So John Calvin and John Knox became close friends. John Knox went back to Germany and did some preaching there, but eventually came back and became one of the pastors at l'Auditoire de Calvin, where John Calvin was the pastor, and then he later returned to Scotland. Oh, before I talk about that, what were the core beliefs that they picked up here? So they embraced and absorbed a lot of Calvinism while they were in Geneva. So some of the personal beliefs or core beliefs were personal conversion, this idea of a new birth, or what we would call today being born again. That was a concept that they learned in Geneva. Salvation by God's grace. They learned about expository Bible teaching, very strict Bible teaching. Covenant theology. We're not going to do a deep dive on covenant theology right now. I think later this summer we're going to do a couple of lessons on covenant theology and dispensationalism, so we'll cover that more a little bit later this summer. Moral discipline. National influence was also important. Up to this time, the people of the church were basically subject to a monarch or subject to the Roman See. Now they actually have influence in national affairs. So that was another concept that they picked up in Geneva. They opposed a lot of the formalities of the Church of England, bishops controlling the church, the formal liturgy, the prescribed prayers, the elaborate vestments and confession, things like that. So in 1569, now what happened in 1569? If we go back one slide, what happens here? Mary VIII ends her reign in 58. So 59, John Knox decides, I'm going to go back to Scotland, where he was still considered an outlaw. And there were several skirmishes, but the Queen Regent, remember the Queen herself is in France. So she has a Queen Regent in Scotland to help administer the affairs in Scotland. So the Queen Regent Mary was ultimately deposed by the reformers. Then a year later, she died suddenly. And Parliament met to settle the religious issues, and Parliament adopted the Scots Confession, abolished the jurisdiction of the Pope, and the Church of Scotland was officially born and adopted a Presbyterian structure for its governance. So that was 1560. So the Reformation is beginning. So then we get to the next slide. Elizabeth is now queen in England. Well, she was not anti-Catholic, but she was not necessarily, she was Protestant, but she was not really in favor of the Puritans. It was more of a, I'll tolerate you. You just kind of do your stuff on the side. Don't cause too much ruckus, too much trouble, and we'll get along. So that was her position in England. So the Puritans, they were inspired by the success of John Knox. They decided now's the time we can go back and start making some reforms. They were also inspired by the Geneva Bible. They now had a Bible that they could read in their own language. It had notes, and it was a great benefit to them for their Bible study.
Are we using Puritans interchangeably with Protestants right now?
No. They became Puritans. Thank you for bringing it up. They were Protestants in England before they left to go to Geneva. When they returned from Geneva, they were now Puritans because they were returning to purify the Church of England.
Okay.
So it's a slight difference, but yeah, it's not exactly the same as you're calling them Protestant. So the Puritans were those who were reform-minded Protestants and wanting to change the Church of England back to their beliefs that they learned in Geneva. So they also, the Fox's Book of Martyrs, which most of you have probably heard of, it's a very famous book, but that came out in 1563. Fox was writing about the martyrs under Queen Mary and under the reign of Bloody Mary. So they were reading about all of these martyrs, all of the persecutions that happened, and they came back. They felt like they had a divine mission. They actually felt like they were the new Israel on earth, and God's chosen people to take his message. They had a very heightened sense of their duty and calling going back to England. So James the first and sixth. He was James the first in Scotland, and then he became king of England as well and unified the kingdom. And so 1603 is when he became king of England. And he became this king, James the sixth of England. He wanted, his main thing is he wanted control. And he tried to unify Scotland and England within the same structure, but both parliaments resisted, and he basically ended up just managing the kingdom as two separate states, if you will. What are you going to say, Scott?
Are you going to talk about the King James Bible?
Oh, well, that's, okay, 1604, that's the Hampton Court. So there is a meeting at Hampton Court where the Puritans said, okay, here's all of our demands. Here's what we want to see, the changes, the reforms we want in the church. So King James listened to the demands and basically went, I'm not going to do any of those things, except they proposed a Bible called the King James Bible. They said, I like that one. So they ended up with the King James Bible.
And it wasn't just the Puritans, it was the Catholics and the Puritans had to get together and do a Bible, and that's what he ordered them to do.
Okay.
So that's where it came from.
Yeah.
Which is hard to believe, but that's.
So he did approve the development or writing of the King James Bible. 1607, James Fort, which we now know as Jamestown, was founded as an English colony in the English colony of Virginia, and separatists, which I'm now using the term separatist, because the Puritans were focused on what?
Reform.
Reform. They wanted to change the church and stay within the church. now they're realizing that we can't change the church and we want to separate from the church.
And
So
the
they're
separatists, that culminated in a fight against the Republic in the Clone Wars, right? Yeah.
You're probably right. I have nothing to dispute that. Anyway, so during this time, after the events at the Hampton Court, they started realizing that we're not going to make any headway. We're not. James is not going to be welcoming of reforms. So they started fleeing to Holland. In Holland, this is just a side note, I guess, they met, John Smith met Mennonites and learned about baptism, the believer's baptism, which up to this point, you were just baptized into the church.
Yeah.
And you remember the church, that's all that mattered. But the believer's baptism was, you have to make that personal confession of faith. And so he founded the first English Baptist church based off of that influence from.
It's not Anabaptist, it's just
From the-
Baptist at this point.
Yeah, it was called the English Baptist Church. I don't know about the Anabaptist thing. But anyway.
Anabaptist is what spun off into the Mennonites, right?
I think that's right.
They were just a
Based in
subject.
That's right. So the Anabaptists weren't in England yet. So the Anabaptists were.
The Anabaptists primarily because they were being chased, because they were going to be killed by the Catholics, by the state, by everybody. They ended up in the northern part of Europe, and that's where they flourished before they set sail.
So then in 1620, we set sail to the New World. Now this is, I almost skipped this because this gets a little bit, there's a lot of history here, but it's important to understand kind of the events here. So I want you to see how the Puritans responded to some of the events here. So Charles I becomes king in 1625, and a large group of Puritans had fled and gone to Massachusetts to set up shop there. Charles I wanted to squelch this movement, so he appointed William Laud as Archbishop. He was one of his allies. Archbishop didn't have any taste for the reformers either, or for the Puritans, so he set up to persecute the Puritans. Well, Charles, in response to that, the Scots, one more. In 1637, he tried to force the issue by saying, okay, the Church of Scotland, you're going to start using the Book of Prayer that we have here in England. And the Scots said, we're not going to do that. And they threatened to military action against the king. So in response to that, Charles, who had previously suspended Parliament because he wanted absolute monarchy, he called Parliament back into session, which was a mistake on his part probably, because the Parliament included a lot of Puritans. So he called Parliament into session. The Parliament actually sides with the reformers, and they arrest Laud. Civil war breaks out between the parliamentarians, which is a lot of Puritans, and the royalists, or the nonconformists. During this time of war, civil war, I can't remember how many different towns, 20 different towns and churches sprang up in Massachusetts from people fleeing England under the persecutions and under the Civil War. Ultimately, we'll come back and talk about the Westminster Assembly here in just a minute, but ultimately Parliament tries and they execute Laud. In 1646, Charles defeated Cromwell, which is one of the leading proponents of the reformers, and that leads to a second civil war. Charles I is ultimately executed. And you think, okay, this is just normal church history, but this appalled people in England. They get all the struggles and everything, but they're like, why did you have to behead the guy? I mean, that's like, you know, depose of whatever, but the act of going in and actually executing Charles really was a bad PR move for the parliamentarians and for the Puritans. What I want you to see in this time period is the Puritans were starting to gain some power. Oliver Cromwell was one of their leaders. They actually took control of England, established a Commonwealth of England for a few years, an independent nation, not a monarchy. But he ended up dying, and the Puritans were so dysfunctional they couldn't sustain it, and it just evolved back into a monarchy. The point is, they had opportunities, but they squandered their opportunities because they were more politically minded than Christ-minded. You know, they were, you know, to a certain degree. Now, the Westminster Assembly adopted the Confession. We'll talk a little bit more about the Westminster Assembly here in just a little bit. But so that brings us through a lot of the history of the Puritans and how they ended up moving to America and, you know, influencing church history. Now, I didn't put a slide in here about what was their contribution, but just based on what you see about the Puritans, what do you see in our church today that we gained from the Puritans?
Personal confession, believer's baptism.
Believer's baptism is a big one. Personal confession, yeah. Pardon?
Oatmeal.
Oatmeal, yeah.
Anti-government.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
pushed it hard.
Well, I would say I don't know if it's anti-government or it's yeah, separation, yeah.
Or Alex's favorite, anti-disestablishmentarianism.
I think that's the opposite, Sid.
Oh, yeah.
So
More
what-
preaching than the
Yeah,
word.
I was saying, another one is the expository preaching. That was a big thing. Bible studies, and so there's a lot of things that the Puritans contributed to what we see in the church today.
And that all came from Geneva, really, most of it.
It did. It really did. So if they had not, so if you think about this, if they had not been persecuted under under Mary, they would not have fled to Geneva, and they would not have had the impact on the world that they ended up having. So, you know, God works all things together for good. That's part of what I want you to see in this lesson, is that yes, there's some ugly things that happen, but God is orchestrating events for His glory. So, now we are already quite a bit behind. So, just very quickly, I want to talk about denominations. What?
This map is so complicated.
Oh, well, that's the whole point. So, you look on here, this was Germany after, do you remember a few weeks ago we talked about the Protestant Reformation, and they had some civil wars, and they ended up with the Treaty of Augsburg. Okay, so the Treaty of Augsburg, if you remember, said that, okay, the princes, the rulers, could establish either Lutheranism or Catholicism, and then everybody in their domain or their realm had to obey or follow that religion, so they could dictate the religion that was followed in that region. They excluded Calvinism, but still you see Calvinism still makes some inroads here. But this is what the map of Germany in that area looked like in the mid-1500s, or during this time frame. That it's divided up. We see all of these different groups, and it presented situations where, you know, Alex could be living in one town, and 5 miles down the road could be in a different realm, and they're forced to have a different religion just because you drive down the road 5 miles. So very confusing. People didn't like that. They didn't like being forced to change their beliefs when they crossed lines or whatever. So this created a lot of conflict. I'm going to skip these. These are just similar type treaties that were passed. But this ultimately, this led to the 30-year war. Between 5 and 8 million people died during the 30 Years' War. think about the population then versus, relatively speaking, this was a very big deal. It started as a religious war within the Roman Empire, but evolved into a political war involving France, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, France, etc. Ended with the Peace of Westphalia, in which Calvinism was officially recognized and accepted as a valid expression of Christianity. It had not been before. Up to this point, Calvinism was a rogue sect. The rulers could choose state religion. The rulers could allow Protestants and Catholics to coexist within the same area. Before, they were separate. You were either Catholic or you were Protestant. You could not be both. And the Pope was excluded from any interference in Germany. So Germany was completely free. It established what we would now think of as a nation state, where Christians could now live in a nation state. This required Christians to live and work together under a common government. They were no longer just receiving their dictates from the Pope or from the King. They had to work together as believers. So all of this, the idea of denominationalism likely arose from the Puritans. And it was not, a lot of times we think of denominationalism as divisive, like, oh, we got all these separate ideas and everything. That wasn't the idea. It was actually meant to unify people, not to divide them. Again, it was the opposite of sectarianism. Sectarianism says that I have the corner of the truth, and I'm the only one that is right. Denominationalism, on the other hand, says there are different expressions of how we live our faith. No one member, no one group has all the answers. So we can peacefully coexist together. And that's the whole idea of denominationalism. So that's another idea we got from the Puritans. Again, I'm running out of time, but part of the Westminster Assembly, the Puritans argued for this to be included in the Westminster as one of their statements. But this actually summarizes their whole idea of denominationalism. For example, since a person is unable to always see all the truth clearly, differences of opinion about the outward form of church are inevitable. So we're going to have differences, but the final bullet point there says the mere fact of separation does not itself constitute a schism within the church. It is possible to be divided at many points and still united in Christ. And that's the most important thing about denominationalism. So what they could not foresee at the time was that we would have hundreds of denominations now. I don't think they anticipated that, but the cat's out of the bag. Yes, George.
Was part of this possible by the separation of church and state? So, because before this,
exactly, yeah,
the monarchy had to be tied to one or the other.
Yeah.
And once you separate that, now the denominations could coexist.
Right, and that was the whole idea, is they said, okay, that it's no longer one denomination or one religion for the state. We can have any and all in one state.
So the Westminster Assembly was from like 1642 to 1649, a
I think
9-year assembly, or sorry, a 7-year assembly?
Yeah,
That's crazy.
yeah.
So what does that look like? Is that every day you go to the conference room of the hotel, or?
I don't know how it was organized, but what came out of that was the Westminster Confession.
Yeah.
That was the biggest thing that came out of that. But then there's a lot of other just doctrinal statements. There's a lot of other organizational decisions that came out of that.
Yeah. I see the value. It's just hard for me to understand what the 7 years, what it looks like from
I know.
that age.
Yeah.
Several of the Catholic councils went over years.
Yeah. This is my first just like recognizing what, like, did they meet once a month for 7 years? Did they meet once a year and they still had stuff to?
Yeah, I
They
don't know.
met for a time and then they broke up and then they would come
It's
back
like
together.
Trent.
Yeah, and they just called it all the Westminster Assembly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, so Age of Reason. We're rocking along here, 1648 to 1789. So this actually started in the Renaissance period, or the foundations were laid there. The Renaissance originated in Florence, changed how we viewed art, literature, music. A lot of things changed during the Renaissance period. But key characteristics there, art became more realistic. Use of perspective and anatomy, scientific thinking grew, exploration expanded. We were starting, the nations were starting to send out explorers to explore new lands. Education and literature flourished during this time period. So if you think about it, what has happened in the last, during this time frame, the 1200s and 1300s? If you go back to 100 years or so, we introduced the scholastic period. After the Crusades, we started building universities, we started building schools, we started educating people in classics, and then we have the printing press, and so now we have books that are available. So education really flourished during this time, and so that informed a lot of what was going on in the Renaissance period. So I call this the Renaissance meets the Reformation. So one of the greatest influences on the Enlightenment was Diodorus Erasmus. His view is that humanity is just spiritually sick. He saw that the human conscience and reason still function, but they function imperfectly. Humans still possess a limited free will and can cooperate with God's grace. He viewed Luther's position. He said that Luther's position reduces humans to passive objects rather than morally responsible beings. So what is Luther's position? He says we're dead in our sins. There's no life left there. The human will is enslaved to sin, totally unable, apart from grace, to love or serve God. Humans cannot save themselves through good works because sin has corrupted human nature. He viewed Erasmus' view. He underestimated the depth of sin and overestimated human ability. So today we would call Luther's view what?
Calvinism.
Pardon?
Calvinism.
Well, Calvin, but what was the total? There's a total depravity. So they didn't call it that at the time, but this concept is what we now know as total depravity. So this was not dead yet, but well, he will be by morning. So anyway, so Erasmus' inflated view of humanity is what really influenced the Enlightenment and informed a lot of their positions. So they felt like the human mind had the ability to reason through and understand God. So this was the outflow of all this education that we established. Another factor was wars. So we've talked about several wars. A few weeks ago we talked about the war in Germany. If I could try to pronounce that again, the Waldeck War. But then we had 2 civil wars in England. There's the persecution of the French Huguenots in France, which were the Calvinists in France. Then we had the 30 Years' War that we just talked about. So what is the effect of all the wars? Well, the Europeans are getting sick of the wars. They're just getting very weary of all the bloodshed, especially when they look at it and they see this is caused by it's religious violence that they're seeing. So their position is if the church, in the name of doctrinal purity, sanctions violence, then the church itself was a wicked institution. That's the conclusion that a lot of people in the Enlightenment period concluded. They said, how can the church, if it's this great and glorious thing, how can it sanction all this bloodshed? So they were more about tolerance. It seemed preferable to enforced conformity. So we talked about the peace of Augsburg. Every year there's a peace festival at Augsburg now, and they paint the buildings, paint the murals on the buildings every year. So this is one of the murals from the recent peace festival. So again, really on the left-hand side, you can read about these guys, but just to show you some of the people who were influential during this time period, the rise of science and reason. What were some of the core ideas here? Reason over tradition. The church was very big on tradition. They said reason is more important. Science over superstition. Tolerance over religious coercion. Happiness in this life rather than preparation for the next. We're all about live life now, be happy. Human progress through education and rationality, not through scripture, but progress comes through our own reason and thinking. This movement marked the rise of secularism in Western culture. So again, you can see some of the guys over here that influenced this age of reason. Not all of these were, some of these were actually Christians. Like Isaac Newton was a strong believer.
Same with Kessler.
Yeah.
Gallo.
Yeah, so these were not anti-Christian, but they were exploring the idea of reason, and it led them to some odd beliefs. So here, talk about faith versus reason. John Locke, for example, he believed in God. He believed that God was rational, that Christianity is reasonable, but he boiled Christianity down to moral behaviors and just a basic belief. He believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and that it teaches people to be morally or ethical. That's what I was trying to come up with. Isaac Newton believed the universe reflects divine intelligence. Science reveals God's laws. Reason and faith complement each other. He was a very strong believer. Blaise Pascal was also a very strong believer. But a lot of the beliefs during this time frame led people to a belief in what we call deism. Deism is says God created the universe but does not intervene in the universe. So they believe in God. He created everything, but then he took his hands off and just let the world operate on its own.
Do deists believe in Jesus?
That's a good question. They believe in a creator. I don't know that they believe that. They might believe in Jesus as a historical figure, but I don't think they believe in him as a Messiah.
So the John Locke, Newton, Pascal, were they?
I'm not going to say that they were deists. I'm just saying that a lot of their thoughts, a lot of the thoughts during this time frame influenced deism. Actually, I do believe that like Blaise Pascal was not for sure, and I don't believe Newton was. They remained strong believers to the end.
Newton was motivated to develop essentially the theory of gravity and planetary motions to try and understand the prophecies of Daniel and the return of
Yeah.
Christ.
Yeah, and he remained very influential, very inspirational. In fact,
There were a bunch of hymns, I think. I used to listen to them as a kid on cassette tape.
That's
Yeah.
probably John Newton.
so I actually, my grandfather was Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton Wilson.
How old are you, Steve?
Anything.
But he was still very influential. That people were naming their kids after him, and when my grandfather and his father were born. So anyway, so we have the rise of deism, and then because dueling Catholic movements. Okay, so this is going back to France. This is kind of a sidebar, but I wanted you to see the progression here of Blaise Pascal. I said he remained a strong believer to the end. The Jesuits and Jansenism were dueling movements or Catholic beliefs in France. The Jesuits were associated with the mighty and powerful people of France. When you went to confession, you confessed your sins. It was up to them to decide, okay, what is the penance that you have to do? And they were very lenient on, well, if there's some justification, some reason that you had to rob that store, then your penance is a little bit, you don't have to do much because we understand. So they were very lenient about how they defined sin and how they doled out penances. cannot say it. It's Jansenism believed that humanity is deeply corrupted by sin. Salvation depends entirely on grace. Human effort cannot save. And this movement became known as Calvinism in Catholic garb, so known derisively by other people. The Jansenists, they called the Jesuits cheap grace. So they had these derogatory terms for each other, and they battled out with each other over time. It's Arnauld, he became the leader of the Jansens movement, he was at a convent called Port Royal. Blaise Pascal's sister, through a series of circumstances, had ended up as a nun at Port Royal, and so he was well acquainted with Blaise Pascal. So they already knew each other. Arnauld said, "Hey, can you come and help us out?" So Blaise Pascal did. He authored 18 letters that became very influential. They later were published as the Provincial Letters, and helped promote the idea of Jansenism. But after his death and after the death of Arnauld, it just fizzled out. They couldn't sustain, they lost their moral or their influential leadership, inspirational leadership.
Did they kind of come out of the Catholic evangelicals who, when Charles V and the King, they tried to put together the Protestants and the Catholics back in the 1500s? It's almost like Jansenism kind of came out of that group of people.
I'm not sure. He's Dutch.
Interesting.
He came from Holland, and then when their convent was destroyed, they actually escaped back to Spanish Netherlands or Belgium. Is where they fled to. So anyway, the main thing I just want you to see is that not all is lost. A lot of people in the Enlightenment period were actually strong believers, but then we get to the radicals. So there's a group in France called the Philosophes. These were the leading intellectuals of Paris. They believed human reason could improve society, government, religion, and education. Some of the leading people here were this guy, Denis Diderot. He was mainly influential because he was editor of the French encyclopedia, which was multiple volumes, which basically laid out all the principles of the Enlightenment period, still referred to today by a lot of Enlightened thinkers. It's the Bible of the Enlightenment, so to speak. Voltaire was also one of the most influential of the Enlightenment thinkers. This guy, so you remember the other, I put this up here, you remember Saint Denis? In the Saint Denis Cathedral? You remember the guy who walked around with his head cut off? So I wonder if this guy ever wanders the streets of France wondering about the other Saint Denis. So my question in the email was, did this guy lose his head? So metaphorically, I kind of think he lost his mind, maybe. So what is the impact of the Enlightenment? The Philosophes argued that organized religion oppressed people, miracles were irrational, doctrine relied on authority, not evidence, religious fervor leads to harmful conflict, church governance is corrupt, and as a result, secularism became dominant, religion became increasingly private, governments moved toward religious neutrality, and modern education, policies, and culture became less Christian. Okay, now, I'm going to try to go through these very quickly. The rise of pietism. Philip Jacob Spinner became a pastor in Frankfurt. He was a Lutheran pastor, and he became a pastor in Frankfurt in 1666, and he was appalled by what he saw in Frankfurt. The Lutheran Church had already kind of fallen into apathy, and were not engaged. So he thought this was really we need to fix this. So he went years trying to preach through the Bible, and then finally he got to, he was preaching through the Sermon on the Mount, and something triggered in his congregation, and there's a fire, revival broke out, and that led him to create twice weekly home meetings for Bible reading, prayer, mutual encouragement. Sounds a lot like the Puritans, right? So the meetings were mocked as the gatherings of the pious. And that's where they got the name, the pietism. I'm going to skip over August Frank, but Nicholas von Zinzendorf. This is important because he was he grew up in a pietist family. His grandmother was pietist, and he studied law, but he wanted to do something different with his life. His family owned some land. During this time frame, some of the Germans who had survived the 30 Years' War, the Moravian and Bohemian Brethren, were looking for a place where they could establish a new base. So he said, I've got some land over here. So he offered the land to them. They established this town called Herrhut, I think is the name of it. And then Zinzendorf became very enthralled with this town and the people. And he joined them. He actually became their leader and became ordained in the church, the Moravian Church, or the United Brethren. So the United Brethren were the first major missionaries that would send people out to other countries, other areas. Another thing about the United Brethren, you'll later see that these, gosh, we're going to have a hard time getting through this, but they later had a huge influence on John Wesley. In fact, that's the reason John Wesley went to Aldersgate and had his experience there. So these were also the United Brethren. Years later, in the 1960s, the Methodist Church and the United Brethren would again come together, and they would merge and form the United Methodist Church. So that's where the United Methodist Church came in. So I'm going to skip the impact here. Let's talk just briefly about Wesley. I mentioned that Wesley and John and Charles here, they were students at Oxford. When they arrived at Oxford, they were surprised and alarmed by the rise of deism at the university. And of course, think about back then, these universities, these institutions were supposed to be religious institutions. So, today we think nothing of, oh, there's a deism movement over on the college campus. Well, yeah, that's, nothing. Yeah, that's everywhere. But to them, this was appalling that students at the university would be adopting deism. So they formed these groups which emphasized pious discipline, Bible study, prayer, etc. People around them derisively called them the Holy Club, or they called them the Methodists because they had a very prescribed method in their approach to Bible study and things like that. George Whitefield was a member of one of these groups. In 1735 or so, John Wesley went to the New World, went to Georgia on a mission trip, so to speak. While he was sailing over there was a huge storm, and he was scared for his life. But he encountered a group of Moravians, brethren, and they were just peaceful and calm. And he said, "Aren't you guys scared?" And he said, "No, they trusted God." And what he could not understand is they were not afraid to die. He could not understand that. John Wesley still did not have this assurance. There's a quote over here that he said, over here, the next column over there. So he went back to London. He left Georgia a complete failure, basically. Everything went sideways in Georgia. So he went back to London, and he was determined to find out what is the secret that these Moravian brethren have. So he found one of their pastors, Peter Bowler, and he said, you need to pursue this new birth that we were talking about. Basically, he said, you haven't been born again. You need to have that experience. So he reluctantly attended a society meeting on Aldersgate where he felt his heart strangely warmed. And there is this quote over here about John and his experience of his heart being strangely warmed. This was his new birth, his conversion experience. And from this point forward, he changed the world. You know, he was on fire. And that's actually the flame on the Methodist symbol actually is a reference to this event in John Wesley's life. So he contributed a lot. The Methodist revival began in England. They started preaching outdoors, which is unusual because they weren't welcome inside some of the churches. Also, their crowds were so large they wouldn't fit in some of the churches. George Whitefield started preaching outside. John Wesley initially said, yeah, that's not appropriate. Everything has to be copacetic. Everything has to be according to, But finally he relented, said, no, this is the way it's got to work. So they started preaching outside, and Wesley famously rode horses everywhere and studied his Bible while he was riding his horse. That's how he studied for his next sermon, and he would just go from town to town to town preaching. And this was the rise of what we call itinerant preaching and outdoor preaching and revivals and all that kind of stuff. All of those kind of things that we're familiar with today evolved out of this experience right here.
Circuit riders.
Circuit riders, yep.
This was England, not America.
And then it started in England, but then they took it to America. So what did John Wesley offer that George Whitefield couldn't? George Whitefield was the speaker. He was the entertainer. He was the one that really captured everybody's heart and passions. John Wesley was not as gifted of a speaker, but he was an organizer extraordinaire. So he organized everybody. He created these societies and had sets and subsets of people, and that really became the church hierarchy that the Methodists still use today. He established that, and then the leaders and the preachers were also coordinated into what they called conferences to discuss doctrinal issues, to do administration, plan evangelism, and things like that. John Wesley never wanted to leave the Anglican Church. In fact, I don't think he ever did. But the first annual conference in England was in 1744, and this was a conference of his followers who were still in the Anglican Church. They were still subject to and loyal to the Anglican Church. 1773 was the first American Methodist Congress, which formally separated the American Church from the Methodists in England. John Wesley said that was okay to separate that church from the Church of England because it was just too hard to manage them across the pond. So they did separate formally in 1784. Then eventually in England they also separated. Methodism, again, I'm going to skip over some of the impacts. I think you can see, we've already talked about some of the impacts of Methodism. Charles Wesley. If you don't know Charles Wesley, I'm sure most of you have heard his songs. He wrote more than 6,000 hymns, at least. Some people put the number at up to like 9,000 hymns. There's a list of some of the hymns that he wrote that you're probably familiar with. And then the Great Awakening started, I know we're just a little bit over time, but I'll go through this very quickly. The Great Awakening started as a series of revivals early in American history in the 1720s and 1740s. Jonathan Edwards preached probably what is considered one of the greatest sermons of all time. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God in 1741. If you've never read that or heard it, I would encourage you to go listen to it or read it. This encapsulates a lot of what the teaching was during that time frame. So George Whitefield brought all this together. George Whitefield was an energetic preacher. He was, he actually became a rock star. Jonathan Edwards had the theology and the idea, and he was already out there doing a lot of things that Whitefield was doing, but he was a dour, uninteresting, just nobody wanted to follow him. But Whitefield, he was exciting, and he was charismatic, and he was emotional, and so he literally became like a rock star in the colonies. Unlike Wesley, Whitefield preached staunchly a Calvinist message, and that created some conflicts between the two of them throughout their ministries, but they still worked together. They were committed to working together. Whitefield also befriended Benjamin Franklin, who printed his sermons, flyers, and other materials that were widely dispersed around the colonies, widely read, and that's what helped spread his message. So and spread his fame. So this was the beginning of the Great Awakening, which is basically just a great revival in the colonies during the late 1700s. And I think that's probably, this is the last slide. What was the impact of the Great Awakening? Actually what I wanted to do is look on the right side. How has the Great Awakening impacted not just the church, but our country in general? Without the Great Awakening, without the Puritans, without everything we learned, we would not have things like the separation. Well, I don't want to say separation because we don't really have separation of church and state.
Freedom of religion.
Freedom of religion. That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you. We wouldn't have the freedom of religion. We wouldn't have democracy. A lot of the things that we enjoy as Americans really came out of this Puritan movement. These ideas that they brought to America and helped form the basis of a lot of what we have in our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, but also shaped the church significantly. You can see all the things that the Puritan movement and the Great Awakening brought to America and helped establish the church that we see and recognize today. So, and that's it. I'm sorry, 5 minutes over.